extraordinary stuff over the weekend from Keir Starmer and from the Labour Party. It does feel increasingly this week, and remember this week is going to be marked and punctuated by the 3 by-elections that are going to take place on Thursday. The widespread expectation within politics and within SW1 and Westminster is, of course, that the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak, is going to lose all 3 of those by-elections. It will be a deeply wounding and a destabilising day in 24 hours for him. Almost certainly no internal move against Rishi Sunak as a result, which you might think would be extraordinary. In some ways it is extraordinary, but it's simply reflective of the fact that the Conservative Party in lots of ways is not only, you could argue, rather out of ideas, intellectually pretty exhausted, but there is no particular clear rallying strategy, alternative strategy in another part of the Conservative Party. There's no clear alternative candidate. Boris Johnson has been dispatched from the House of Commons, and in a way that has a connection to what Keir Starmer has been saying over the weekend, because although there is no clear alternative strategy from within the Conservative Party to Rishi Sunak, you have the extraordinary, perhaps, sight and spectacle of a Labour Party being led by Keir Starmer, which in many ways is adopting the Rishi Sunak strategy, at least with regards to the economy. What you can see over the past 3 years of the Starmer leadership is a gradual move, slowly at first, incrementally, but then faster and faster, moving towards a more orthodox, and let's be honest, pretty small c conservative set of economic ideas. What the party has been saying over the course of the last 24 hours, and indeed far before that, is that the only real option for the Labour Party and for the country is to emphasise what they call sound finances and to be as careful as possible with the nation's money. And they're doing that because, of course, they want to set up a contrast with Liz Truss and what they say was Liz Truss's example of smashing the economy. And that is the line that you're going to hear again and again and again, trying to remind voters of that as we get to the next general election. But the question is that enough? Is that enough and all that we can hope for from a party which is hoping to replace a government which has already been there for 13 years, and by the time that we get to the next general election will probably have been there for 15 years? Is the danger for Keir Starmer now and for the Labour Party that simply it becomes more of the same? And that when you have a government which is 30 points behind or 20 points behind in the polls, that to have an opposition masking that government, moving towards the political positioning of that government, can that really be, maybe it's a credible political strategy, but is it really what the country desires? And more to the point as well, forget about the politics. I think there's no doubt, look, we'll see what happens on Thursday. Usually in politics, we in Westminster and political journalists, we like to create narratives, and narratives come and narratives fall, and Rishi Sunak's doing a bit better and now maybe he's going to come back. The Conservative Party has not led in a single poll since 2021. There is now ample evidence to suggest that the Labour Party, at the very, very least, is going to be the biggest party after the next general election, and if it's not, heading for an outright majority. That is impressive. You think about where Keir Starmer was and the Labour Party was back in 2020. People were talking, political journalists like me, we were writing up the potential for the death of the Labour Party. The 2019 general election, the worst since 1935. People were talking about at least 10 years, talking about 10 years of Boris Johnson. It has been a transformation. If you'd shown the current political outlook to any Labour MP or Labour supporter back in 2019, they would have bitten your hand off, your arm off for it. And yet, in terms of the policy prospectus, what Starmer has done and where Starmer has moved is very different to where he started. And the question, I suppose, if you're a Labour supporter and what I want to talk to you about is, what is the point of a Labour Party? What is the point of a Labour government if there isn't money to spend? Because the comparison is always made with New Labour and 1997. There is a very, very big difference. Yes, it is true that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown decided to map and ape and promise to stick to conservative spending pledges, which they did for 2 years. The difference was, and this is absolutely crucial, the difference is that spending at that time, the economy at that time, was growing, and it was growing strongly. So they could sit safe in the knowledge that, okay, they're doing this for political reasons, we're going to stick to Tory spending plans for 2 years. but that after that, they could turn the spending taps on. And when we think of the legacy of that new Labour period, that is what that was all about. It was about the transformation in the schools budget, the transformation in the National Health Service. There is no prospect, it seems immediately anyway, of the Labour Party being able to do that because the economy is sclerotic now and it is going to take a long time to get back to anything like it was in the new Labour period. And so then you're looking at a Labour Party and a Labour government potentially overseeing the politics of scarcity. And the politics of scarcity and the history of the politics of scarcity within Labour governments, when the national pie is getting smaller and they're having to oversee a smaller national pie, it is not a good one. You think back to the Labour governments of the 1970s, the first Labour governments in the 1920s, 1930s. They usually do very, very badly. And so Keir Starmer needs an alternative strategy to think about what politics looks like when it isn't simply divvying up and giving out more of the national pie. You could argue maybe that's what he's trying to say he's going to do. He's talking about reform, but it is very, very unclear. I follow these things very closely as a political journalist. It is not clear when we look at the Labour plans for health or Labour plans for education. It is not clear what those plans for reform are. They might think that they want them. Starmer might be talking about them, but 12 months out, 18 months out to a general election, it is not clear where they are at all. Your thoughts this morning on where Keir Starmer is, where the Labour Party is heading, and whether you think that there is any point to even voting for the Labour Party if it is moving towards a position which is looking more and more like Rishi Sunak's. Or maybe you think Keir Starmer is doing exactly the right thing because he's taking the party to a position of economic credibility. Grace Blakeley, economist and commentator, someone who follows these things very closely. Grace, thanks so much for joining us on the show this morning. What do you think of where the Labour Party is on the economy now?
I think you can imagine what I think about where the Labour Party is in the economy now.
Well, remind our listeners.
Of course, we've had really more than a decade now of deep crisis. You mentioned that the economy was sclerotic, and that is true. There are a lot of factors going into that. There are global factors. There are domestic factors like the fact that the average worker didn't have a pay rise in a decade following the financial crisis, and then wages fell during the cost of living crisis substantially, and only now just beginning to recover. And that's obviously causing a lot of pain for a lot of people. But there's a more deep and profound problem here, which is that we've had several decades of just a total lack of investment. And I mean investment in our infrastructure, yes, in, transport, in energy and all these different sorts of things, but also in our social infrastructure, in, the public services that keep our economy going, that make sure that our kids are educated and able to get good jobs, that make sure people are looked after, and that actually create a substantial amount of demand in the economy. So I find it just astonishing that we're now sitting at this point where we have all these deep crises in our public services and in the public realm more generally. And Keir Starmer is sat there saying, I'm simply not going to do anything about it.
But there is a point, isn't there, which is to say that actually we are now, an incoming Labour government would be have a more difficult and less room for manoeuvre on the economy than any incoming government, certainly since 2008, arguably, in the sense that actually over the last 10 years, you could have QE. Interest rates were very low. Governments could borrow easily. We're not in that position at the moment. So actually, he's just being honest with people in saying that the government is not going to be in a position to borrow as much as it might once have done.
Well, I mean, it's certainly true that we don't have as much room for manoeuvre. But, Lewis, as well as I do, that the UK is a large economy. It has control over its own monetary policy. It can issue its own bonds. Sure, those are going to be a bit more expensive now than they might be at other points in time. But ultimately, we can afford it. We have this absurdly simple view of a national economy as you get money in like it's a bank account. You get money in your income and then you've got a certain pot and you're able to spend it. And that's absolutely not how the government works. The government uses its spending as a means of putting resources to work, as a means of kind of catalyzing growth, as a means of making sure that the economy can grow over the long term, whether that is, as I said, putting in place the basic infrastructure that businesses need in order to, grow and develop, or whether it's making sure we have an educated workforce, making sure that we can invest in research and development. All of these things are what are responsible for growing the economy over the long run. The classic example is after the Second World War, the UK had an astonishingly high debt burden, and it didn't, go straight for austerity. We actually had the creation of the NHS, the kind of weaving together of a coherent welfare state. And that debt ultimately reduced over the long run because the economy grew. We cannot grow without investment.
How close do you think the economic policies macroeconomic policies are now between the Labour and Conservative front benches?
It is quite difficult, to be honest, to tell the difference. When Keir Starmer is talking about public service in the NHS, right, I understand the argument that it is not just about money, because it isn't about money. But if he was then going on to say, right, well, we need to do things like reverse the extraordinarily expensive wave of privatisation that we've seen in the NHS, with, private providers being brought in, paid billions of pounds to deliver subpar services, or the PFI contracts through which lots of hospitals were built that cost much, much more than they should have. Anything on that would actually be some progress. It would put some clear water between him and the Conservative Party. But given that is not being said, that we have actually some Labour ministers saying we need more privatisation within the NHS, it's very, very difficult to see on public services, on spending, on macroeconomics more generally, what actually differentiates Labour from the Conservatives, and actually even on social issues as well now. So it does feel like, I think you did quite a good job of explaining the situation actually in that intro. Keir Starmer's basically decided, I don't have to do anything. And the thing that worries me the most about that is that people look at our political class and they think no matter what I do, nothing changes. And when you feel like that for a very long time, where do you go? To the extremes, and particularly to the far right. And I'm very concerned about that.
Grace Blakeley there, economist and commentator. Kind enough to say I did a quite good job explaining the intro there. Quite good. And, that's all we can hope for. It is, after all, only Monday morning. Look, we're going to take your calls and get to your calls very shortly on this one. And the question about whether, really going to hone in on, is whether or not you feel that there is much gap now, an ever-lessening distance between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak. And that the next election potentially is just about personalities. And actually, you could argue, they've even got quite similar personalities. They're both quite technocratic. They're both sort of just like John Major-ish kind of figures, one for each party. And what the point of voting Labour can be and is, other than just getting rid of the Tories, and you might think that's a good idea in and of itself, but does it really get you very far once Labour has won an election?